Greetings and welcome to the Destination Goa Trance podcast, bringing in-depth interviews with artists, label people, organizers from the golden age of the 90s to the modern era. My name is Tibus and I'm here with the one and only Simon Peter.
Hello everyone, I'm excited to be here. Let's talk about horror trance.
Hey, what? This is a Goa Trance show.
Well, indeed, but today we have a special treat for our listeners because we had the chance to talk to Mark Petrick, also known as Xenomorph.
Wait, isn't Xenomorph the main antagonist in the Alien series? You know, the 3 meter tall guy with acid blood, double jaw, and comes out of chests when it's still an infant?
Yeah, but today we're talking about the Goa Trance project called Xenomorph that was started by Patrick in 95, and it was one of the very first deliberately dark trance acts in the world. He came out with a really dark and heavy Goa trance sound filled with screams and noises from horror movies, and this is why his music is often described as horror trance. He made a couple of albums throughout the 90s and early 2000s, while his sound was also evolving with each new release and featured guitar parts as well as vocals on some tracks, which was still quite unusual for psytrance at the time. In recent years, he became more active again, and he's playing live gigs and releasing new tracks. And his new album titled Netherverse just dropped on Suntrip Records. Have you heard it already? How do you like it?
I love this new record. Listened to it many times. In fact, the more I listen to it, I like it even more. To me, it feels like that he continued the style of Cassandra's Nightmare, which is his debut album, but the sound is modern. The atmosphere is also a little bit more positive. I wouldn't call it horror anymore. Maybe apocalyptic sci-fi? What about you?
Yeah, I agree. I would say Subdimensional Anomaly, one of the tracks from the new album, is one of my favorite tracks right now. It has such a haunting soundscape and also beautiful melodies. At the same time, it's an interesting combination. I haven't heard such a Goa trance track in quite a while, honestly.
We sat down with Mark to talk about his career and his new album.
So, welcome to our podcast. We're glad you're here and accepted our invitation. Why don't we start from the beginnings then? How did you start playing music? What was your first musical influence that started you on this journey? Can you recall what was really inspiring to you to start playing music?
Well, it was a long time ago. I did start out in a school band, just with two other guys. We were kind of the outcasts and we had similar musical interests that I would describe as, early goth, post-punk kind of influences. Basically, I was starting as a bass player. It's funny enough, back then I was a big fan of the U2 bassist, because somehow wrote really cool bass lines and the production of this bass was also sitting really well. Yeah, that was basically my start. Funny enough, on one recording session that we had, the guitarist was somehow ill and we were paying for that studio and then we had to find a solution like, okay, how do we record the guitar? And I never touched the guitar before, just the bass. And then I was like, okay, it has strings on it, so let's try, So that got me then also a little bit into guitar playing. But the majority of times I was back then playing the bass.
And how did playing a live instrument band shift to electronic music?
How did this happen? Yes. Well, actually, it was with the advent of samplers. I recall that I was investing quite some sum of money into an RKS 1000 sampler, which I still have in my rack, not being used anymore though. That was basically a technical miracle because I was able to sit alone at home and replace everybody. I could do the drums, I could do vocals, keyboard parts, and record guitars if I wanted to. And that was really inspiring for me to, because playing in a band is kind of difficult. Like you always have to arrange with other people. Hey, do you got time? And there's some issues. So I was always very kind of keen on getting something out, getting something done. And with this sampler, nothing could stop me. You know. Funny enough, though, the music then changed quite drastically. You know, because back then I was influenced by many kind of genres, you know, and it was mainly electronic body music that I was influenced a lot in this time when I purchased the sampler. And that actually led into my first electronic body music band where there was no room for bass, even though I did play the bass guitar in the live performances too. But I was basically the songwriter, and since I was the one-man guy, I was also then the singer. And that project was called Terminal Warfare. Yes, I also recall that in that time I was hanging out with some other electronic body music freaks, and they were telling me about their band, which was called Whippet of Trench. It was more like a Skinny Puppy influence, I would call it. I was supporting them as a keyboard player.
So that was like the early 90s,
Exactly.
when this EBM sound was getting more popular, I guess. And that was also kind of the beginning of Goa trance, basically coming from the same roots a little bit, but it was two very different scenes at the time.
True.
So how did you get in touch with the Goa side of things? What was your influence there?
It was taking quite some time, actually. Like, I was doing this EBM thing for 2-3 years down the road. At some point, I got very interested in this acid music that was coming out back then. Berlin was really like a breeding ground for this early techno stuff. What I really liked back then was, we talked about it earlier, the hard trance sound, which not many people know. I would describe it, you know, or the ones that really stood out for me were the ones that were really melodic, but this music used to be really fast, like sometimes 180, 190 BPM, you know. So back then, I decided to get my own attempt at it, you know, okay, let's try to make this kind of music. I have a sampler and synthesizers, you know, so let's do it. So that was basically the birth of the Xenomorph project right there in 93, when I made my first demo tape. And for me, it was very interesting because my catch was to make something like, you know, most trance was really emotionally uplifting. There were a couple of very melancholic tracks, I remember, you know, LSG and stuff like this. So that influenced me a lot to you know, approach this from the side, to make it a bit more like not so happy, but emotional and maybe even a bit sad. Yeah, emotional and very fast music. Like one track was even like 190 BPM. So this will be a surprise for many people who think, oh, Xenomorph started out with 190 BPM, but that's the way it was.
What fascinated you in the Goa trance? The melodies, the mood, or?
And yeah, let's get to that. Okay, that was the first demo tape, you know, and I was even sending this out to Steve Mason and even Concept and Dance. I remember I wrote to them. In 95 or so, I was writing Apocalyptic Ritual, which was kind of, you know, it was the bridge between that hard trance sound and the Goa sound. And my first really contact specifically with Goa trance was actually when I was reading a local magazine at work, and I found this article very interesting where they were talking about some Indian hippie that is in town and he's spinning like techno music. I was like, that sounds fucked up. I mean, nowadays it's so normal, but back then it really sounded fucked up when an Indian hippie is going for techno, which usually, you know, you got these clean cut guys and the guy had like full dreads. So the one that I'm talking about is Goa Gil. I went to this party and couldn't leave the dance floor, you know, like this was really for me. eye-opening and ear-opening to hear also these EBM influences, strong snares and stuff like this. Yeah, so that was my first contact.
How did you find different aesthetics? I mean, it was more like really this hippie kind of Indian thing, a totally different visual style. Was it also interesting to you, or the whole underground culture of this, or was it difficult to stomach first?
Well, respect to you. You really got into my shoes very well. It was in the beginning a bit strange, but I was there for the music. I really didn't care too much. So sometimes even I showed up in black and others were in fluoro trousers and whatever. But that didn't matter because we were all kind of there because of the music.
Your first Goa trance project was Dharma 7 with Dominic Sangeet, that's right? Or was it after Xenomorph?
No, that was later in the game. I think there was already Cassandra's Nightmare out.
First of all, why did you choose to create Xenomorph project? And how conscious were you about the sound that you wanted to create? Did you have a plan that I want to take this route? Or was it more intuitive that this type of darkish music comes from you?
Well, actually, my very first track was simply just a self-therapy attempt, because I was really lovesick back then with some woman, and I had to express this musically. And like I described earlier, like I wanted to do something that was probably considered really unusual or punky, to take this positive techno thing and, the 4 on the floor beat, but to make it a bit dark. I always, from the beginning, had this tendency to do that,
So you always had this kind of interest in darker sounds and like musical themes that are darker, but you are also using a lot of film references as well. So samples from different horror movies. Are you a big fan of the genre? I guess you watch a lot of horror movies then. Was there like a big influence on you? How did this start? Did it start with the books maybe, or was it a movie that you watched?
Books as well, but mainly horror movies indeed. That was basically the go-to reference, Let's put in a Fulci movie and let's see what happens when you get to the sins after watching that, But I even had a membership card in a local video store. I mean, it's very difficult to relate it to modern people how this was working back then, because nowadays everything is accessible. You can download it in an instance from the internet. But back then, to have access to unusual movies that are rated extremely, and you couldn't see them on the TV, it really required like a special place that had all these VHS cassettes, and you had a membership card and rented out the stuff. So I frequently went there and did silly stuff like, okay, let's take all kinds of movies that have dead in the end, Island of the Dead, or stuff like this,
People nowadays cannot even imagine that you were renting out VHSs. Remember that time, and then later DVDs a couple of years later. And nowadays everything is just there by 2 clicks.
Yeah, and you had to select based on like recommendations. Maybe a friend said, "Oh, this is a good movie, you should watch it," or maybe you read it in a magazine, but that was it. Was there any particular favorite movie that you really liked, or you go back to rewatch sometimes, some classics?
Certainly. I'm a big John Carpenter fan, which nearly is a bit mainstream for that kind of field, but this man is an excellent storyteller and has the atmosphere. And of course, remarkably, he's a wonderful music producer. Like many of the soundtracks of his movies are made by himself, and they are big influence on me. Yeah, I mean, I used to like Dario Argento. Nowadays, maybe not so much anymore. I mean, it's such a long time ago, and I became a different person also. But I remember Hellraiser, for instance. This whole series was really nice. And of course, you can call it a horror movie, but the Alien series, really, really interesting. Mainly actually Italian directors like Fulci, I mentioned already.
Did you choose the Xenomorph name to your project as a nod to the Alien series, or you like the original meaning of the Greek word?
Both. Actually, really both. Like I first got in contact with this term, of course, in Alien 2, but then I looked it up and then I was like, this exactly describes my approach, like Xenomorphos means strange shape, and that described my project really well. That I always wanted to not be predictable, do something that is unusual for the genre, and yeah, that's why this was fitting.
It is really fitting, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, indeed. Your first release under the name Xenomorph was the Obscure Spectre, right, on Coyote Records.
Exactly.
And how did you get in touch with the label? How did this collaboration start? Because I think you also had a number of compilations where your tracks were released with Coyote, so you had partnership for a while with them. How did it start?
It started actually, I would say the first modern style Xenomorph track that was not so melancholic and hard trance influenced was Carnage Vision. That was actually the first one that I wrote. That's also just on the CD version of that Obscure Spectre EP. And then I wrote Obscure Spectre and Telepathic Combat. There was one other song that I was recently thinking and didn't remember what was it. It might have been Necroid Millennium, I don't know. And I slapped them together onto a demo DAT tape, back then DAT tape, yeah. And I basically made some cover with it and wrote on it 4 horror trance tracks. And any DJ that I gave this to, they were like, fuck, even Gorgel, like, horror trance, fuck, that's good. Let's check it out, and he played it even out a lot. I remember there was some Berlin party where Dauer was playing, and a friend of mine gave me the tip, okay, give this guy, he has a label, Coyote Records, give him a dot, and I gave him the dot. And a couple of days later, the guy called me and expressed his interest. Okay, you're fucked up. I like fucked up stuff, so let's do something. And then we had the idea to start with an EP, which was a real big success. And then we did the album. It was a polarizing success. Now I still remember when the guy told me that, some DJs were really hating on me and him, like, hey, I played this Obscure Spectre track on a party with the girls, and suddenly you had this middle part where the guy is slashing himself and the girls were crying and they hated on me as a DJ. I don't remember if I felt sorry for it, but, that was a funny thing.
Did you already play live around that time with your own music?
That's interesting. It was a studio project for a long time because there was just no opportunity to do that. And I think the first Xenomorph ever gig was a record release party for Cassandra's Nightmare that I organized myself in BKA Theater in Berlin. I don't even remember, maybe there was 80 people or something, and I was taking the full gear, like even with a big mixer and stuff like this, like full car load. And after a while, I think the first international gig I had was for these Boom guys in Portugal. It was my first kind of international experience, and then I played in London, Enlightenment Party. So that's how this started.
You already said that the response was polarizing, but if you think about your first live gigs, how did the audience react to this? Because I think they never heard such music before.
Yes, but surprisingly, they took it rather well. Like, I mean, maybe I kind of, I remember this Enlightenment party in London. I started with the set with Cassandra's Nightmare, the title track, which is really like atmospheric and slow. And that was in the middle of the night, and that kind of dragged people quite out of their dancing schedule. But apart from that, usually the response was always positive. But I have to admit that I was always surprised by it because I expected sometimes people to be more upset also, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, it's interesting that if you listen to interviews with like Goa Gil or some of the old guys who were in Goa, they also tell about how the night music was different from the daytime music in the old Goa parties, and some DJs would slip in like these more darker music songs or tracks with even these horror samples sometimes, but it was still, I think, not very well known at the time, or maybe just I think other than your project, not many other people were doing really dark Goa styles back in the mid 90s.
No, I don't remember any. Funny enough that you mentioned the separation between playing in the sun or in the night. I remember playing on the Boom Festival, I think it was in 2002. And when I arrived, I was actually supposed to play at 2 in the night, so this typical time. And I also had just such a set prepared, full night set. And then when I arrived, the guys told me, hey, we are on the fourth day or something like that. And we have like a 8 or 9 hour delay. And I was like, what? Are you kidding me, man? So, and it was like 25,000 people. It was like, I don't have anything that I could throw in that would match this time of day. And back then, like you so correctly described, this was very strict. Like in the night, there's this kind of sound, in the day, there's this kind of sound. Nobody would ever mix that. But I was really in a tough spot there. But I was like, okay, let's rock it. Let's do it. And you know what? It worked. Like, people didn't really seem to be so upset. There's a funny story to this, though. You want to hear? I keep telling this in backstages, so I can tell it to you guys. No. Talamaska approached me. He was also there on this party, and he described to me like he had a real good sleep and he had a good tent with a view on the lake. And then he opened the tent and enjoyed the nice landscape. And then he heard from the dance floor, "Welcome to hell." And he was like, "Oh, I think Mark is playing." So I kind of spoiled his morning beauty of landscape enjoyment.
That must have been a funny experience for him, but
I just wanted to say a lot have changed since those days, because now you have festivals that are only playing dark music from the beginning to the end.
Yes.
yeah, I think there is a little bit of a difference now also in the sound of what people call dark music these days, because and I think the way horror movies have changed throughout the years is also a good analogy to this, or a good example that nowadays you would see a lot of gore maybe, or a lot of violence in a horror movie, but the plot is sometimes like very sketchy. You can predict the jump scares when things will happen, so it's all a little bit formulaic, a little bit predictable.
Yeah.
And if you look at, like you mentioned, John Carpenter, for instance, the Mouth of Madness is like not very gory, not very like jump scary movie, but it crawls under your skin a little bit. It's has this kind of psychological horror element that just stays with you, and it shocks you without showing a lot of blood or something extreme. And that was again something common in the 90s or in the earlier days in the genre of horror. And I think also in the Goa trance genre, it was more melodic, more story driven music. And with your music, I think it's also like that. It's darker, but it's also a very melodic and story driven music. Especially Cassandra's Nightmare album is very story driven. I think the whole album. So why do you think things have changed, or do you also see this kind of change in the music landscape today?
I must admit I do. And I totally share your observation. Like, you could even go further back with the horror movies. Like, for instance, look at Roger Corman. All these Vincent Price movies, they were not bloody at all. You maybe saw one drip of blood. It was all about this excellent actor, the excellent lighting. That Mario Bava was also a very good director who used very unusual lights, red, green together and stuff like this. And that was creating the suspense and not exaggerated gore effects with no story, like exactly you were describing. But concerning the reasons for that, sometimes I have the feeling it's like a reduction of attention span, that the modern media drives people to have a much reduced attention span. So if somebody watches a contemporary horror movie and he doesn't see a head chopped off after 3 minutes, he will just switch it off or so. It might be a reason for it, I don't know. And with the music, it's kind of the same. It's maybe, I also call it sometimes a formularized approach, that the primary driver for some artists is not to stand out, but to kind of converge to a certain style, and that makes it maybe not stand out that much. I mean, that's the whole point when you want to converge to something.
Let's talk a little bit about Cassandra's Nightmare, which you released in '98. Can you tell a little bit about the concept behind it? Is Cassandra referring to the Princess of Troy, who could see the fortune, but nobody believed her?
Well, if I remember, it was the daughter of Priam, but I'm not. It's such a long time ago that I was into Greek mythology, so forgive me if I mix things up. But it's this mythological figure that was plagued with having visions of the future. Basically, this title implies, to look into the future and maybe see something that is scary, So that was the encompassing concept behind the album, to make something that peeks into some realm that you usually might not want to go to.
Looking back at creating Cassandra's Nightmares, what are your most cherished memories, and which is your favorite track from that album?
Oh, that is really difficult. Really difficult to answer. I think it would be Obscure Spectre, because that took me quite some time to make it, and somehow it came out really perfectly, just for me personally. So if I listen to it nowadays, I'm like, how the fuck did I write this? So the other part of your question was, what was my favorite track? And
so how was it constructing your first album?
Yeah, that was actually quite funny, because back then I was living in a cheap apartment in the outskirts of Berlin. I was the only guy that had a hair color in this house, meaning like all the people were pensioners with gray hair, and in the middle of them was the guy that was writing the dark trance tracks in the night. And so that was kind of funny. So I remember frequently just going to my car with an audio cassette that was parked a bit closer to the park. But then, like, there was a little forest there. And then I could bang it in the car and I'll say, the kick is too loud or something, and then go back and fix it. Another memory that I have is that it was quite difficult to record that, because most people nowadays can't actually imagine how this was done back then. To give you an impression, we used to record that to duct tape, digital audio tape, to be able to deliver to the pressing plant. And you were basically just lining the track up, hitting record on the DAT player before you had to get the right level, because if you had a peak, like an so-called over 0 dB, then, you had to reset it. And back then I had quite a huge collection of analog synthesizers that I used for this album. And they all came into application in the tracks. So this was more like a choreography to record such track, what most people would think, So I don't know, the song starts and you rush over to the Arp Odyssey and fiddle with the filter, and then you remember, there was some passage where on voice to the expander I have to turn the filter and then go back to move rogue and I don't know, do this. And if you messed up or you were not happy with it, I kind of, there was like 4 bars of the filter movement, but I wasn't able to switch the filter back down, or I don't know, the button on the Korg S700S fell off during recording. Can all happen, So you had to restart it. So to come up with a successful take, you make like 20, 30 attempts to do that, Nowadays you have mixing automation, so all these filter movements, they are kind of perfect, maybe too perfect even, But that was funny back then.
Basically, you had to write a script for yourself and you had to do a performance in the studio to record it.
Indeed. And, you were also running into technical difficulties. Like, for instance, Apocalyptic Ritual had a mini Moog D playing the bass line. And that thing sounded great, but it kept detuning itself even over the span of a 7-minute track, So basically, I had to retune this by ear ever so slightly while the track was playing,
So did the technology also shape your sound a little bit later on? Or did you try to experiment with the new technology, new sounds later on? I think the next album was a little bit more minimalistic, so to say, a little bit more like building progressively, playing with different elements. Was it also influenced by how the recording and synthesizer technology was improving in the 90s?
Yes, most certainly. Because on that album, I don't remember jumping around between synthesizers. Maybe Mahmoud Temple, which isn't even on the album, but originally actually was supposed to. It was some kind of mess up by the label, but that was still recorded on an analog console. In the time when I wrote this album, this so-called Cubase audio and hard disk recording became quite prominent. Since I was not closing myself to technological advances, I kind of embraced it. Still missing the analog sound though, but on the other hand, you have the convenience that you can save everything, because that's another issue of what I didn't mention about running around between the synthesizers, like for instance, in Necoid Millennium, I used an ARP 2600 for these noises in the beginning. And I had to really write the faders down, which patch cable did I put here? Because then I wanted to work on Torrent and Insanity for a while and then switch back to this one. Then I had to repatch the ARP synthesizer exactly. And you never got it this in the same way. So I remember I purchased a Nord modular back then that I used quite extensively on this keyboard album. And it was, of course, really nice because you could basically save these patches and you don't have to rewire anything. So technological advance certainly had its influence on production and recording process. But I would say my love for, I would call them cross-modulated or frequency-modulated sounds was always there. Because back then I chose basically my synthesizers based, or a lot based on the fact that do they allow cross-modulation, or any synthesizer did that. So when I found the OM expander, I was like, wow, you can modulate even the filter like crazy. And with a harp, of course, you can do it too. The non-modular, of course, allowed you really things that were really difficult to try on analog if you wouldn't have like a modular, like a real big modular system, like, I don't know, modulating pulse width and stuff like this. I mean, certainly you mentioned it's more progressive sounding, Of course, there was also, I didn't want to repeat myself, Cassandra's Nightmare was good as it was. And with keyboard, I also had a different conceptual approach, like basically I kept enjoying making it darker because I really do recall that some people kind of put me a bit on the spot. This guy with his dark shit, he doesn't see the light, and my argument was always, hey, guys, and you just see the light and forgot the other side of the coin,
Before we talk about the 2000s, in the 90s, you have two projects. Can you tell a little bit about Dharma 7? And I think you also had one with Dara Lee, the Brighton Trash Department, I think it was called.
Brighton Trash Department, a really fun project. I must really say I enjoyed it so much because basically I remember I was flying over to Dara Lee, who used to live in Devon back in that time, and we were locking ourselves up in the studio and starting to write something. And the direct inspiration was actually also, again, a John Carpenter movie, because this one track, Devil's Dyke, and I don't know whose idea it was, but one day we were having a walk with this dog, and we were going to a place in Devon that was called Devil's Dyke, it's at the ocean. And I felt like that. Show me, that sounds really interesting. And that reminded me of the Fog movie by John Carpenter. So I was like, okay, let's get this video from the video store and sample parts of it. This old sailor having this interesting story in the beginning and throwing together some sounds, and that was really, really inspiring. And for the B-side, then we needed something funny. And already back then, this whole kind of Goa tourism got a bit funny. So Dara had the idea, okay, let's make like a bit of a persiflage on this whole thing, and let's write a song called Costa del Goa, like all these Spanish low-cost holiday tours, you could also apply it to Goa nowadays. And then basically we wrote this track, really looking back to it and enjoying the time.
Your next album was released on Gnostic Records, which is your own record label, or was at that time. Why did you choose to create your own record label?
It had a bit of artistic freedom motives in it, because even as free as Coyote Records were, but I wasn't sure if they would be willing to follow me into this kind of darkness that I wanted to really go into. And I also was quite ambitious to create the whole artwork myself, have this full package, like that. I didn't have to ask anyone to do that, And also back then, I think Coyote Records were not really keen so much on staying in this kind of music industry. So it all came together. And it turned out to be quite difficult though, because as you can imagine, I would call it internet boom, there was already some early form of internet back then, but it was difficult to, as a one-man label, to market your album. I think I had like 2 advertisements in some Greek Psy magazines, and that was it, and get all the pressing done and delivered and carry all the things up the stairs and shit like that. That was interesting.
Yeah, I think the beginning of the 2000s, especially like around 2002, 3, 4, many labels that were active in the 90s got closed down. So the landscape was changing. Also, the sound in psytrance in general was changing a little bit.
Big change.
Did you find it more accepted? The sound, the kind of sound that you were doing, was it more accepted at parties, or was it getting more popular around that time already, or notice a change in also this area about more interest in the darker sounds in those years?
Yes, indeed. Actually, now that you say it, that was really like noticeable that let's say I couldn't shock the people anymore as I used to enjoy it back then, because I really looked into quite scared faces in the end of the 90s. But back then it was like more like you just have the whole audience like, yeah. And that was also the time when I played quite a bit in Budapest also, which had a really appreciative crowd. Yeah, and that was also the time when I noticed that, like suddenly got a lineup and over the course of the night, and I noticed, okay, this is all kind of dark sounding, and I used to be usually the only artist that stood out so much. And in that time, this kind of changed. It kind of became more general. I would even say that's also the time when this term dark trance was kind of popularized, because I always related to myself as horror trance, but even that, if you look on Wikipedia, is somehow associated to some people now, and not me, but who cares? That is basically what happened in the mid of the noughties, first decade of the new millennium.
Your second album, Killer Poet, has many references to Jewish mysticism through the track titles. And I always wondered what is the concept behind the album. Can you tell a little bit about that?
Now I must remember. Well, I do recall reading Aleister Crowley literature back then, and this guy was quite big on astral projection, like, not the band, but the actual thing. And particularly, he also described on his astral journeys places like Malchut. And I also did read parts of Kabbalah, it's a really big book, and in a way fascinated with it, because it kind of describes creation in a way that comes more naturally to a scientific understanding of how I would scientifically go ahead and try to explain the creation of the universe. Because the Judeo-Christian explanation that the world was created in 7 days, like, why exactly 7, didn't really match this scientific thinking that much. And I took a bit of freedom with this album to give it something that's non-referential to Kabbalism, basically you got this tree of life, and I kind of turned the whole thing around to the tree of death, So that's, I think I also put it that way on the cover, but I'm not sure. with the Zephyr and all of this.
Yeah, that also, as we discussed, it's in the sound. It's also a more experimental album, a bit compared to the Cassandra's Nightmare. And I really liked one of the tracks. I think I just don't remember the title right now, but it also uses like a scream as a pad sound, like a sustained high pitch scream in one of the tracks.
Tommy, Shari, Abaddon.
Yeah, and it's like a really, I find it like a really ingenious use of a sample in a kind of like a dark context that not everybody is doing. I mean, it's easy to just throw in a horror sample or have some noodling with the filters and come up with some sounds that sound twisted, but to really merge the two concepts, like having something dark, human, and mystical, and use it as an instrument. I think that was a really nice idea. Was there any other idea like that behind the tracks? How you created the tracks that you really wanted to express something musically, some concepts?
Well, I always like to paint pictures, like I think it's great if you can write music where people close their eyes and they can see some images, whatever that might be. In tracks like Shari Abaddon or Gehinom, I really wanted to go there, Gehinom means hell in Hebrew. So I really, in the middle, I really made room for a passage that is quite, laid back, atmospheric. And I even used the sample of a porn movie inside to give it that sinner vibe that, now that you know it, you might even be able to recognize it, but many people probably don't. So that's what I tried to do. Actually, recently I did remix that track. My friend Yoram found me a nice sample that I was of a woman speaking about in Hebrew, fit exactly well into that middle passage when the whole track goes like crazy, Yeah, that's basically, I think, something conceptually that all tracks have in common, like in Sepulchre, I try to take people to the graveyard, with the vampires flying around, So I took maybe from the few open air parties that I used to go myself, was always this, I'm always the kind of guy that sees the devils jumping out of the wall and not the fairy tales and butterflies, So I try to port that also into the music, but what could somebody be triggered with that is exposed to this music on an open air festival, will he see the devils as well, And that's when things like these screams you mentioned come into play.
You mentioned that you try to paint pictures with your sound, but to me, every Xenomorph track is a story in its own. It's like an essay, actually. So every track has an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. Do you agree with this? Do you also try to tell a story with your tracks?
Always. That's actually the hardest part, that to put it all together in a way that it seamlessly melts into each other. Because during the writing process, of course, you mainly fixated on a loop. That's the curse of electronic music, I would call you. You're always in some kind of loop, Then you need to build bridges to the other parts, What is very connecting factor in many of my tracks is that they do have a finale, like usually in the end, the highest climax is reached. For instance, I once wrote a track, Chimera Shadow, and that was supposed to go on a compilation. I was still in the Coyote times, and it was a bit too long. And then I got a message, hey, the track is a bit too long, so we had to cut the last part. I was like, what? That's the most important part of the whole song, you know? So no way, and let's cut something before, I don't know, you know. In most tracks, like, you know, Antimatter, you couldn't really name all of them. You have the climax in the end, you know, which is, if you look at how movies or books are being written, it's the same, you know, some kind of development of intensity and so. I tried to do it differently though on this one track on my new album, where Nebula of Souls, where I thought, okay, now I'm gonna break this pattern. I will make the climax in the middle and then kind of give it some kind of chilled ending, you know, just because I felt like, am I repeating myself too much with this? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's always good to experiment a little bit, even with your own formulas, if you feel already comfortable with this. But yeah, I think when it comes to themes, you often work with similar ideas, I think. So you had the Demagoguery of the Obscurance. That was the third album, also released under your own label in 2007, right?
Mm-hmm.
So was it like kind of an apocalyptic vision for the modern world, basically, or is it like conspiracy theories? What was the main inspiration behind that?
Well, let's go back there. I could summarize it as after Clipboard, where I went, you know, to the mystical, fictional horror scenarios and painted those pictures. The first decade of the millennium was not a too good time for me, I must say. You know, things that went on in the world. So I had the idea to maybe address now the real horrors that are out there, you know. So we mentioned conspiracy theories. Like a key moment, of course, was September 11, you know, which happened in the beginning of the decade. And I still remember when that was all over the TV, you saw these airplanes flying into the skyscrapers. And still remember that there was something in my head saying, this makes no sense, you know, like all of it. And the further you kind of go into all kinds of aspects of it, you know, why there's like a third tower that was not hit by a plane and where there was just one fire on one store of the whole thing burning for 3 hours and then the thing perfectly collapsed into each other and policemen standing in front of it announcing the building is going to blow up, please go back, you know, how did they know? So things like that made me look quite critically on the world that I always years before considered, oh, everything is good, you know. But it's the same, it's this yin yang thing, you know, like the world is as good as it is bad. Or a modern perspective that I have on it is, it would be more like it is a reflection of you, you know? So if you concentrate on bad shit, you will see bad shit, you know. But back then, I was obviously focused on that a lot, and so there were a couple of researches that I did into. You know, I was digging deeper, like who could be behind this, or who runs the world really, you know, and if you look a lot, you find a lot, and that's kind of got me into this whole field of secret societies and basically this mindset of very slowly trying to gain control over the whole world, you know. It started in 1776, you could say, but it might, you know, this idea is as old as man. You know, there are some psychopaths that want to control all the others. So basically, the concept of the album is more like a chronological progression from, you know, Prognosis 1776, where the Illuminati were formed, and then slowly going through these phases, you know, where basically at some point, where they call revelation, the obscurance, where many people never understood what does the guy mean with the obscurance. Well, that is the people that stay in the shadow. You know? They don't want to be in the light because it's easier to control stuff if nobody knows about your existence. You know, it has shifted though because nowadays there's public coverage of Bilderberg conferences and stuff like this. You know, and sadly enough, I mean, was even remember in 2006 when I was in Brazil, I was writing then tracks like World War III, A Nuclear Winter in the Sun, you know, like only me can do shit like that to be in a beautiful sunny country and write such a morbid piece of music. Especially tracks like World War III, I mean, also the cover art, you know, you can clearly see, okay, I put there's a picture of Stalin on it. I stood away from putting the picture of another person that we all know there because I thought maybe it's a bit too risky to put him. And you also find an Iranian on there, you know, Ahmadinejad, and like pictures of mushroom clouds and stuff like this. This was all things that were in my head and I had a vision for. I must admit though, nowadays I regret a bit that I wrote this album because if just, I mean, the tracks by itself, the music, or I, you know, have a reason for existence, but just, you know, like what's the benefit of this concept, you know? I mean, many people talk to me now, oh, you saw it back then already, you know, we have this war and everything. I was like, yeah, I shouldn't have focused on it, right? I mean, not that I want to say I created all of this, but nowadays I tend to focus on more positive things, you know.
You mentioned that the prognosis 7076 is to the date when the Illuminati was established. And I always thought that that's the date is connected to the American independence, actually.
It coincides, yes.
You also used guitars and vocals on this album. And just one quick question regarding the vocals. Is the lyrics somewhere to be found?
They are actually printed on the booklet of the CD.
Ah, right. Unfortunately, I don't have the CD. I just bought it from Suntrip, so I will have it.
Lucky bastard. I think there was like 20 or 25 CDs remaining in stock, and those flew off the shelf immediately as they were announced. I think it's a very sought after album, also on Discogs and everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
How many? This was released by your own label. How many did you press at the time?
I think it was 750 or so, because that was exactly the time also when the music industry was going down. You know, before you were doing a couple of thousands, and you had to be careful. That might have been also the reason why I never really felt like putting out the fourth album. You know, got tired of the music industry after that. But the lyrics you can also find online, I think, and they pretty much describe what I just referred to. You know, like there's just two tracks with lyrics. One is one is about that I refer to as economic sabotage, which is basically an explanation. When you look at what is going on with the economies around the world, you could think like, hey, if someone had the plan to really destroy the economy, that's exactly what he would do, you know, to basically push inflation and impoverish everybody, you know. And the other one is basically the secret satanic hierarchy, which is partially about the mythological figure of Lucifer, you know, the light bringer, which is an often misunderstood figure. Not that I want to in any way advocate Satanism, you know, I don't care. It's more like, you know, just the mythological figure. How does a fallen angel feel? But it also has another side aspect to it that is, you know, that so-called people that refer to them really as Luciferians, kind of, they have their bloodline and that influence stuff. And that's what this song is about.
Yeah, no, also totalitarian democracy is like a very guitar heavy. It's almost like an industrial track actually. So it's again a kind of a crossover, but it totally fits the concept of the album. So, but yeah, there was a long hiatus after this third album. I think you released a few tracks maybe online on your own Bandcamp maybe a few years ago, but for a long time there wasn't much output from you, right?
That's right. Yeah, it was basically a little pause for me, to do other things in life, because I was doing this since '97. It's quite a long time in the business. Basically, it just then started with DNA gathering because they managed to put together a really beautiful old school scenario, managed to dig up all artists back then more than nowadays they do it. No, that's when I kind of got back.
You also worked as a mastering engineer. I think the Xenomorph project made a huge impact on the dark psytrance scene. Your psychedelical effects, but also your samples, and you also mastered some of the masterpieces of the genre, like Orestes' first album or Ukalan by Atrium. What do you think about your impact on the dark psytrance scene?
My impact? Naja, it's difficult to describe. I mean, since you mentioned before, I was like one of the first that did this. I guess I met many artists that described to me or expressed to me that they are big fans and that my music kind of changed their life or their approach to writing music, So there's certainly an impact or influence at some point, But once this whole thing got going, I think people influence each other. So the way this sounds nowadays doesn't have really much to do with the old stuff,
Did you like that music that you were mastering? Did you enjoy these albums?
Most of it. I was just talking in Israel with Digital Talk because I was mastering the album also, and this one I really enjoyed. There were, of course, a couple of productions that didn't kind of touch me musically too much, but I was just working on it from a technical perspective.
Do you like to collaborate with new artists, like to have maybe a vision or an idea that is interesting to you and would need a little bit of a helping hand to achieve these kind of dreams?
I must admit, I prefer working alone most of the times, and my main advice to artists would be just to not focus too much on what somebody else is doing, but to get some kind of self concept, to go inside and understand, okay, what's special about me or my vision, and bring that into sounds and music, and that I think the music industry would benefit a great deal if people would have that approach rather than let's YouTube how to write Asterix baseline, things like that.
So, about more into the present times, you released 2 tracks on Suntrip compilations in the more recent years. And of course, there was a Netherverse EP last year, and now you have the new album. Regarding these new tracks, to me, they sound not that dark, and they also have some kind of, let's say, sci-fi in it. Do you agree with that?
Sci-fi elements, you mean?
Yes, not in samples, but the whole mood of the tracks is more looking into the future, kind of.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's maybe a bit of a cosmic horror, so to say.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, well observed. That is something that I'm more interested nowadays, and I will come to the Netherverse concept later. But it's basically on one DNA festival, the guys from Suntrip were approaching me and expressed their interest to work together. Luckily, they did, because I don't know, I would maybe still have a couple of tracks laying around in the cupboard, but not putting them out, but they made this happen. So that's when, that was basically Dying Sun, I think the first track that was on the compilation. And then they made another compilation that they themselves refer to as something like Horus or something like this. And since I was so many years out of that, I didn't even know what is it. Horus? Okay, what is this? And basically, when you wanted to understand if I could write a track that would fit on there, I was just sending them some idea. Okay, I made something, and they kind of instantly thought, okay, it would fit. And out of this was then born the idea to actually come up with a fourth studio album, which was already then quite a long time that the last one was out. And you want to ask me specific questions maybe about the album before?
Yeah, but before that, I want to ask about the Negative Time EP. First of all, why did you do this EP? Did these tracks did not fit the album concept, or the EP has a different concept? And I also want to know a little bit about the beautiful cover that it has, because it looks awesome.
Yes. Well, actually, the idea for the EP was to have it as a teaser for the album. So to take one track from the album and make it the title track, and put some more tracks, because the Junkyard track was already out on the fourth compilation, but I mixed it in a bit different way with a different kick and more like basically all the things that going on the background are a bit more upfront, because I felt like with the first mix they were maybe too much in the background and they're missing their impact. Yeah, the cover is a real cool thing, because it's quite a personal thing, because that's how I actually feel in the moment, like exploring the world and from a different perspective, but also with this fragility of being naked.
By Negative Time, the title, you mean?
Yeah. Well, it relates a bit, of course, to the whole album concept, Netherverse, and if you scientifically look at the universe, then of course you always have to consider the time aspect as one of the dimensions, But funny enough, actually, this whole negative time thing stirred up my interest in many years ago, more than 12, 13 years ago, when I got interested in over unity research. And I am not by trade an electro engineer or something, but I kind of learned some skills to put together circuits and stuff like this in research. Maybe the most known person is Nikola Tesla, like his patents and other approaches to maybe create something that gives more in than out. And I stumbled back then in that time about, phenomena like negative inductance, because I was working a lot with coils, like, wires. So basically, with all these experiments, there's always a theoretical background to it, So if you would look at something like an equation, this equation is also written on the album after the track to give it like a different mix name. A negative inductance would mean that time would go backwards, So just from a pure theoretical physical perspective, it it would mean that energy can be produced by setups where time is going backwards. And that fascinated me because, of course, we all have this forward progression of time in our minds, but certain setups could actually really do that. And, the circuits would turn cold instead of hot, and it's really interesting things happen then. So that was basically the main inspiration for the title itself. But it also fits perfectly into this whole Netherverse concept,
Yeah, so can you tell a little bit about the concept of the album that just dropped? And I have to admit that it's awesome, and I can just only recommend to listen to it.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, everybody's familiar with this universe, and there's this approach that some people have to look at the multiverse, which describes like a Photoshop layer, like you could sit in the same room in the same time, but there's infinite variations of you and that place in the same moment. That's basically the idea behind the multiverse. And being such a dark person as I am, I had my own connotation to it and thought, like, so what about, in mythology, you have this thing like Netherverse, and Netherworld, so the underworld. It's like an old English, you would call it Netherworld. And I had this idea, okay, so what about the Netherverse? So we have a whole universe that is a parallel reality where things are not as pretty, So the dark universe or something like that, which somehow goes back also a little bit to antimatter, which is kind of like maybe a little teaser in that direction. Basically, most of the tracks are influenced by this motive, I would call it. However, it's not so uncompromisingly dark because I mentioned already I'm a different person nowadays, so I'm not like watching horror movies all day and much more positive person. By going back to the roots, which is what I did musically with this album, I kind of felt really in my place, because like, for instance, the third album musically it's maybe interesting, but if I look at all my albums, I would say it doesn't stand out that much, So Cassandra's is probably also what most people would agree the best album, and so kind of wanted to go back to this original Goa sound because things were all right in that time, And so, Negative Time also has, I would call it, quite some jolly moments in the middle, like Goa sequences and stuff like this, Yeah, when I think about the songs, I mean, the title track itself is, of course, a bit melancholic and dark, but
I think it's a great album, really.
I have a question regarding the cover. Is that you who is grabbing the listener into Netherverse?
that's me.
Nice. Yeah, I really like that cover too.
Which one is your favorite track from the album?
Well, I like Sinister Contours because, again, it has such finale that I was really putting a lot of work into get this really like climatic. I do like subliminal and subdimensional anomaly also a lot because it's kind of a personal track just from the emotion that is inside. Dying Sun was already out before. I mean, those are the ones that still out. I mean, I do like always my title tracks, because they are so different, usually ambient tracks. But with this one, kind of, it's a bit an homage to the Deepish mode sound, I would call it. But somehow meld it all together in this setting, with conceptually and Xenomorph sound. So it's an interesting result.
So is it concept now? Do you plan to play gigs more with the new material, or do you sometimes play the old tracks?
It's always a mix, because I'm not a big fan of keep sticking to one kind of sound, because you will always have people, you didn't play Cassandra's era tracks, or then other people really like the third album, so I think I get it nailed quite well in my sets to combine all of it. I mean, there is, of course, in my last sets, an overhang towards the new songs from the new album to promote it. And I think they can stand the test of time also compared to the old songs, So if it's like a retro Goa event, I would have no problem playing the new tracks, because they fit, they are retro Goa tracks if you think about it.
Your back catalog is really hard to find. Okay, Suntrip has the couple of CDs, but of course, Cassandra's Nightmare is unable to find it. Do you plan to release them digitally, at least on Bandcamp?
Let's see. Could be.
All right. Because there is a demand for it, at least from both of us here. We would love to have them digitally as well.
Okay, good to know.
What are your plans for 2024? Where can people see you live? And what are your long-term plans for Xenomorph?
Good question. I'm not prepared for that. Well, I play a couple of festivals this year, towards the end of the year in Mexico also. Hopefully more in Israel. It all depends on the war situation, of course, but I'm kind of confident or positive that there might be a chance to do that, because I really enjoy playing there, I must admit. And I recently posted somewhere, okay, now the fourth album is out, time to make a fifth. But I shouldn't take maybe decades to do that, but do it a bit quicker. I also have ambitions to release some of my ambient stuff finally, or this trance project that I talked with you earlier about. But, unfortunately, I don't have a full day of time to do that. And, if you just stick with it in the evening, it's hard to kind of get something done. But yeah, that's basically. I mean, I do have, of course, already a concept for a fifth Xenomorph album. It's different from the others that I think could be a good one.
Interview with Xenomorph. We hope you enjoyed it as much as we enjoyed creating it. If you have not heard this new album, Netherverse, go visit Suntrip's Bandcamp and check it out. You won't be disappointed.
Thanks for listening, people. We did not compile a playlist for this episode because Xenomorph's back catalog is not available on streaming platforms yet. Instead, we recommend to check his new album out. If you enjoy the podcast, hit the like button. Be sure to subscribe for more. If you have any ideas, questions, leave a comment or message us on Facebook or Instagram.